Next we will look at subqueries under the from clause. One application of them are nested aggregations. And we will see that we can define subquery macros, and they are called views. An SQL query computes a table, so it makes sense to use a subquery wherever we can specify a table. So for instance, in the from clause, we specify tables that we want to query from. And SQL allows us to put, instead of these tables, a subquery. Let's have a look at an example. I will throw this into the online system. So let's have a look how this query works. The query gives us the student ID and the percent that the student has obtained of the maximum number of points on homework 1. We select the student ID and we divide the number of points that the student has obtained by the maximum number of points obtainable, and we multiply by 100 to get a nice percentage. So you see that in this from clause we have a subquery. This subquery computes the join of the table's exercises and results. We declare a tuple variable x that ranges over the rows in this subquery, so in the result computed by the subquery. For each of these rows we check whether it is homework 1, and if so, we include it in the output. So the subquery takes the place of a table in the from clause. Let's have a look what the subquery does. So the subquery joins the exercises and results table. It gives us, for every student ID, the category, the number of the exercise, the points obtained by the student, and the maximum points that were obtainable. So the maximum points are taken from the exercise table, whereas the points really obtained by the students are taken from the results table. And from this table, we can then further compute this percentage obtained. We take the student ID and we divide the points obtained by the maximum points obtainable. And that's exactly what the query does. If we go a few steps back, then we see that we have here this subquery, so that will give us this table. And now x is a tuple variable that iterates over this table. For each row we check, is it a homework 1 result? If so, we output the student ID, so the first column value, and we divide the points by the max points and multiply by 100. And to make the table a bit more nice readable, we call the column, this attribute, we call it percent. If I would leave this out, then this column would have an ugly name, namely the formula that was used to obtain this column. So we can name attributes or columns by saying s and then giving a name. An important application of such subqueries on the from are nested aggregations. We will still learn about aggregations. Roughly speaking, aggregations allow us to compute the minimum, the maximum, the sum, or the average of a certain set of values. And using subqueries under from, we can nest these aggregations. So for instance, we could compute first the average points for each homework assignment, and then we could compute the minimum of each of the averages to find maybe the worst done homework assignment or something like that. A restriction that is imposed by SQL on subqueries under from is that tuple variables introduced in the same from clause may not be referenced in the subquery. So for instance, this query on the slide is illegal. The reference to s in the subquery is not allowed because the tuple variable s is introduced in the same from clause. This restriction is somewhat a pity because sometimes it may really make sense to write such subqueries that reference tuple variables in the same from clause. However, unfortunately SQL does not allow us to do so. A view declaration allows us to register a query under a given name in the database. It's important to understand that we register the query and not the query result. In this example, we create a view called homework points, and this view, homework points, will be short for this query. So we can also think of views as subquery macros. So we declare a macro homework points that is short for this subquery. We can use this view wherever we can use tables. So for instance, we can query this view in the from clause. Again, I want to emphasize that the view should be thought of as a subquery macro. Using a view is the same as filling in the subquery. If we declare a view, we do not declare a name for the result computed by this subquery, but we just declare a name for the subquery itself.